The next guest is Dr. John Almarode. John is a professor of education in the College of Education at James Madison University. In 2015, John was awarded the inaugural Sarah Miller Luck Endowed Professorship. In 2021, John was honored with an Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia. Most recently, he was named a Madison Scholar in the College of Education and was awarded the Madison Vision Teaching Award. At James Madison University, he continues to work with pre-service teachers and graduate students, as well as actively pursues his research interests, including the science of learning and the design and measurement of classroom environments that promote the greatest gains in student learning. John works closely with John Hattie's Visible Learning Research. The Visible Learning Research Base represents more than 2,100 meta-analyses comprising more than 132,000 studies involving more than 300 million students around the world. The Visible Learning Research has identified more than 350 factors that influence student achievement. He's the author of the Illustrated Guide to Visible Learning, an introduction to what works best in schools. He's also an associate professor of education at James Madison University. And we'll talk about a lot of the things that you've been doing in recent years with your research and your studies. But first of all, tell me about the time when you were in the trenches in Master Clouds.
I love that question. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm so excited about the conversation that we're about to have and unpacking some of these ideas around being in the trenches. For me, it was my first teaching job. I was a math and physics major. Well, first of all, I've always wanted to be a teacher, given. But I wanted to have as many content courses as possible. And hang tight, I'm going to come back to that. So I did not do education. I did straight math and physics, counting on the opportunity to have a provisional license and being hired and then do my teacher courses later. Well, I was in the classroom for 30 seconds before I realized I was in the trenches, because I was in front of a room full of students that did not view math and science the way I viewed math and science. But yet I was to get them across the finish line for Algebra 1. So there I stood in front of students that did not care about math. They were not interested in math. They were great students. That is nothing about them personally, but their perspective on learning mathematics was completely the opposite of mine. But yet I tossed aside education courses, deeming them meaningless, because I figured if I knew a lot about math, I could teach math. And I realized I had no idea what I was doing and had no chance of successfully impacting their learning. And I was in the trenches immediately.
So how did you work through that first year?
So I went back to basics. I literally went back to the mental model of an effective teacher. I went through and thought about all of the teachers I'd had in my career that had the greatest impact on my learning, that I felt like I learned the most from. Maybe not that I enjoyed the most, but that I learned the most from. And I tried to pull those characteristics and simply imitate them in the classroom, literally. I may not have liked Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so or Miss So, but I remember learning a lot from them. And I just tried to replicate it. So at that point, it was survival. And then realized, wait a second, I need to know more about how people learn. In particular, how do my students learn? And so I started immediately into a master's degree and started taking courses in how people learn. And it's the replication of what I remember working. And then on top of that, the new learning in education that allowed me to dig out of those trenches. And the other part, of course, was admitting to the students that I love math. I know you don't, but we've got to make this work. And so building those relationships, I learned so much in those first few years.
Yeah, and I think a lot of new teachers struggle with that, whether they've gone through the traditional teacher prep program or are jumping into the classroom kind of cold like you did. But I resonate with the fact, like I was teaching French and, I was so passionate about languages and just everything that I'd experienced, right? And coming to that conclusion that like my kids were not going to have the same passion for the language, but really, learning to build those relationships with them, see it from their perspective and make it interesting for them. So yeah, I think a lot of us go through those challenges, right? And it's a lot of trial and error this first year. So I introduced you talking about the a work that you do with John Hattie's research in the Illustrated Guide to Visible Learning. Talk to me a little bit about kind of how you got involved with the research and what led you to writing your latest book.
So those two questions are going to be the answers to those two questions are going to be so polar opposite.
Sure.
So I want to tell this story. I just arrived at JMU, taking my first faculty position, and my current faculty position. I love where I am professionally. And so someone handed me the original Visible Learning book. And visible learning, 800 meta-analyses about student achievement. And I opened it up and I looked through it and I thought, my gosh, this is the most boring book I've ever seen in my life. There are no color photos. It's nothing but words, 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 words. And I thought, I'm not reading this. So I gave it away. It wasn't too much longer. Oh yeah. And he knows this. He knows. So then someone else gave me a copy of it. And I thought, this is the second time I've seen this book, not doing it. So I gave it away again. And I tried to give it away to someone that I was seeking vengeance on.
Oh, wow.
Here, you're going to love this book. Go read it. I say that somewhat usually, and then finally, the third time it crossed my desk, I thought, wait a second. This is the third time somebody's given me this book. So I took it with me to the beach. That's true. Because I thought, you know what? I'll just sit on the beach and I'll read through it and thumb through it. Well, I started it and I couldn't put it down. And I thought, what is this? So skip ahead a couple of months, and I had a chance to attend an event where John was speaking, and I listened to it and I thought, wait a second, that sounds pretty good. Then I had a chance to meet him, and then by pure chance, and however you believe chance occurs, I'm not going to get into that belief system. That's not the purpose of the podcast. I found myself presenting with him. And we hit it off and started to work together on other projects, specifically the translation of the meta-analyses into classroom practice. So what does it mean that something has the effect size of 0.86? What does it mean that something, right? So the translational part, and the rest is history. But what's fascinating is that now I'm switching to the next part of the story. So we've gone from giving the book away because it was the most boring thing I've ever read in my life to the illustrated guide. One of the challenges that we all have is making heads or tails out of research. Yeah. Given the teachers have so much on their plate right now, and so much is being put on their plates, but nothing's being removed, that to then ask them to translate a research study into classroom practice, it's absurd. Furthermore, we now know that the translation of that information is highly dependent upon the context. So how I translate something in my classroom and how you translate something in yours is going to be completely different because context matters. So we have sought to help make sense of the visible learning findings, and the illustrated guide was that next step. How do we help individuals move away from the visible learning database is a list of top 10 strategies? That's not it. Like, you can't just pick the top 10 and say, do every one of these every day and we're going to crush it, because you won't. How do we make sure we don't look at those with lower effect sizes and snub our nose at them? Because there are certain things that have lower effect sizes because they're indirect influences. So you can't get rid of buses or principals or finance directors or school buildings. So how do we make sense of it? The illustrated guide is the latest attempt and the most successful one to date of taking gigantic amounts of data and saying, here's the story the data can tell, and here's how you might leverage this research into reality, or these potentials, effect sizes, into powerful practices that accelerate student learning. And so Doug Fisher was the one that said, hey, let's do an illustrated guide and cut to the chase. So Doug and Nancy and John and I, over winter break from our universities, put together the illustrated guide, along with Aaron, who is the illustrator, who is brilliant, took our words and turned them into pictures.
How long did it take between the time where you were finally deciding to read the book on the beach and starting to speak with John Hattie?
Probably about a month or two. It
Oh,
wasn't
wow.
long. Um, because, and I will say, one of the motivators to reading on the beach was I knew I was about to be introduced to this individual. And I thought, all right,
Okay.
that was a bit of a motivator. It wasn't much longer before then I found myself communicating with him, presenting with him, and then all of a sudden partnering with him professionally in multiple ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like it was fate. Like people kept handing you the book, you didn't want to read it, and then you finally read it and realized that this made sense. And then, working with Fisher and Frey and having the illustrated guide. And what are what's some of the feedback from K-12 educators in terms of how they're translating the illustrated guide into their practice?
So the feedback we're getting is pretty powerful, especially the way it's broken down into here's the database, but the database is just a database. What are the four key messages? And so one of the things we did with the illustrated guide was we pulled out what are the four big banner worthy ideas that come from 2,300 meta-analyses. And then what do those messages prompt us to do? So the thinking about this is really into the research of decision making, right? And as you dig through the cognitive science and the neuroscience of how we make decisions, we can't just stop at bumper sticker statements. Every child can learn. Okay, yes, but that's a bumper sticker, right? What then does that belief compel me to do in the classroom that's actionable each and every day? So what we did was broke it down into those four key messages, and then those four key messages become signature or inspire us or compel us to do certain signature practices. And the feedback we've gotten around it is how streamlined and simplified it's made the interpretation. So it's not just about an effect size, it's about how I leverage that effect size to make decisions in my classroom. And then here's the best part, the foundation of it all is gathering evidence to see if I had an impact. That's the big one, because the evidence tells the story. The evidence tells the story.
And I think a lot of teachers in their PLCs, they've talked about visible learning, they've talked about effect size. And I think, like you said, a lot of them didn't know how to make sense of it, right? How to leverage that, how to gather evidence. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of evidence teachers gather for their evaluations, for their portfolios. They upload artifacts at the close to the end of the year, at least for K-12 educators, but really making sense of that in their PLCs. What would you say to teachers who are starting this work in their PLCs, but might not know how to make sense of it for newer educators or for teachers that really aren't familiar with the visible learning framework?
So the conversation, that's a great question. Because I don't really, what I want to avoid is giving a streamlined process where everybody has to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Spot. Because the answer is we don't really have a single launching off point. It's a matter of what is it that isn't working in your school or classroom, or what is it that you have questions about? And then how do you know that that's a challenge, right? So for example, and this could be a very long-winded answer, so please don't hesitate to wave me off. The starting point is knowing where your students are, where you want to go, and the plan for getting there. So it's a matter of having enough evidence to know, hey, my students have challenges or are not making gains in this area. Okay. Or how do you know that that's the case? Well, we have evidence. Okay, great. So what interventions, strategies, approaches, or supports may help close that gap from where I am to where I'm going? Right now, how are we going to implement this? What are things we have to consider? And implementation also means, what do I need to de-implement? And then finally, how am I going to monitor my progress? Now, that's the academic answer. Here's the real answer. I sit down with my PLC and we look at our literacy data and we're like, wow, we're not making progress in comprehension and fluency. Okay. Who's not making progress? Everybody or different groups? Then, all right, so what are we doing now that's clearly not working? What are some other, okay, so let's go see what the database says about reading interventions. Oh, it says this, this, and this. Excellent. Let's bring those in. How are we going to implement these with I guess, I don't want to say sustainability, but that's essentially what it is. How am I going to do this so that it's reasonable and it's something we can tackle? Well, it may mean we have to quit other things for the moment that aren't working. And then how are we going to make this and monitor the impact it has? And so I would encourage PLCs to have those hard conversations. Where are we? Where are we going? And how are we going to get there? What's going to get us there? And what are we doing now that doesn't seem to be working? And being comfortable enough to say, let's put that on the back burner for a minute and direct our energies here. So what's the bumper sticker answer? It turns out the visible learning research has this finding that is just awesome. And so if you've got socks on, grab them because they might get knocked off here. It's not what we do, and it's not how we teach. It's how we think about our teaching that seems to be the biggest predictor. And so a teacher that thinks about their teaching the way we just described, or a PLC that thinks about it that way, is going to be more effective than a group that just simply picks the top 10 strategies. It's not what we teach. It's not how we teach. It's how we think about our teaching that seems to be the predictor.
Yeah, and I think that piece has been lost in a lot of PLCs. They go round and round. They decide, okay, we're going to use this. We're going to take away that. We're going to try to implement this and that next year, and kind of going around in circles, as I see sometimes when especially new staff are onboarded from year to year. But it's not so much thinking about the teaching, right? The meta-analysis, right? The looking at like the effect size. And I think a lot of teachers are aware of, some of the strategies in visible learning, but really looking at what can we sustainably implement, right? That will work, but also analyzing everybody in the PLC's own teaching, doing peer observations, I think is huge. But a lot of schools just don't take the time or, fund subs to come in during planning periods to be able to do that. So,
I mean, so as an example of this, this is one of my favorites, and this may resonate. So pick any strategy at all. Classroom discussion is 0.82. Reciprocal teaching is 0.74. Jigsaw is 1.20. Pick any of them, right? And so if we just get into, oh, well, visible learning says that's a high effect size, so I'm going to do it. And because I teach social studies, this is how this works. So we go into our social studies class, we drop in a classroom discussion on our lesson plan, and what should have been a think, pair, share becomes a think, pair, stare. So then we throw up our hands like, see, these kids, it just won't work. These students. And then all of a sudden, what the challenge is here? I almost said problem. I guess it is. The problem here is our thinking got in the way. Number one, it's not the students. It's not the students, right? The students are the students, right? What we did was we didn't think through classroom discussion. Instead, we got focused on the what and the how, and we forgot to do the thinking part versus saying, all right, I want to do class discussion. Are my students ready to do a class discussion? Well, have they ever done it before? No, I've never used it. I've always used lecture. By the way, negative 0.35 effect size. So if they're doing discussion for the first time, then we're going to have to teach how to engage in classroom discussion around federalism.
Yeah.
And its impact, right? So then we have to then scaffold that in. Scaffolding, 0.52. So we have to teach sentence stems, question starters. We might have to teach how to respond to someone who says something that you disagree with or want to add to. So we have to build that skill set. Then we have to make sure that the questions we ask are classroom discussion level questions. We can't ask, do you believe that federalism is the best way to go? Yes. Not a good discussion question, right? Because so there's so many other things we have to think about before we even implement class discussion in a way that is going to increase the potential of it working. And the database has yet to find any evidence that strategies have a differential impact over grade level or content area. So when we say things like, well, it's different, I teach math. It's not different because you teach math. There's no research to back that up. Well, you don't understand. I teach social studies. Actually, you don't understand. It doesn't matter. And so we've got these other ideas swirling, but it all comes down to how you think about your teaching. And when something doesn't work, do we blame the students or do we think about the decisions we made as a teacher? It turns out blaming the students lowers our impact. Reflecting on how we implemented it ups our impact.
Yeah, I think that's a good piece and an example, because I think a lot of teachers dive into something like a Socratic seminar classroom discussion, things like that, and they expect students to know like what type of sentence stems they need to use or how to go about this. When we're doing something like that, students, there might be a few that have done something similar, but everybody has a different background. They've had different teachers coming up, and I think to make it effective, like you said, it's going to be the teacher thinking about what do they need to implement before we actually do this activity.
And we're living in that in my house right now. And I'll leave names out of it to avoid singling out anybody. But my daughter's 7th grade social studies teacher, there's no feedback given at all. And then they're told, well, just go study. We'll just go review. We'll just go study. Time out. Have we taught them what it means to study concepts? Do they know how to study skills? Have we taught them to study? Do they know what that means? And if the answer is we haven't put, well, they should already know it, that's bad from the start. Assuming or living on the assumption that they should already know it when they come through the door has never worked in education for the past 150 years. Instead, we have to meet them where they are and take them where we want to go. And I think, and that was always one of my challenges when I taught Algebra 1. I assumed they had 8th grade math under control. When I taught pre-calculus, I actually said out loud these horrible words to my students. If you're in pre-calculus, I'm assuming you remember and can apply everything you learned in trig. If not, you should go drop the course. I said that. Which is why now when I see former students, I go and apologize to them because I was in that same type of thinking versus pre-cal. My goal is to get you to that target, but I need to know where we're starting this race. So let's spend these first couple of weeks to diagnose. So then I know how to make decisions I need to get you to that. Or we're going to get to the target. I guarantee we are going to get to that target, but I need to know where you're starting from. That is the appropriate way, according to the research, versus I expect you to know it all, or I'm going to spend the first 3 weeks of the year reteaching everything from last year. Both of those decisions are ineffective, and the research shows it time and time again.
Yeah, no, it's really, meeting them where they're at, right? And when you're having to reteach information, but really having that goal in mind, but making sure students are aware you're meeting them where they're at, I think is the most important thing. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the work that you do at James Madison University. So you're in your 14th year there, and you teach methods courses, so learning theories at the master's and doctorate level. So talk to me about some of the research projects your students are doing. You said that they talk a lot to people outside of education in their research.
So right now I have, I would say 3 parallel projects running, and I have research assistants helping, and students are always willing to help. One of them is looking at struggle, this concept of struggle, because I think, and this might be a bit of a lightning rod, and so I apologize. I've got to be careful how I say this. Oh, well, forget it. I'll just say it. Productive struggle, completely wrong. My goodness, and not even close. So when we say things like, well, I'm going to plan for productive struggle, you can't. That's complete garbage. Now, is there productive struggle? Of course, but how that happens. So what we're doing is unpacking the concept of struggle from the teacher perspective and the student perspective to get at what we really mean there. But to say that I'm going to plan for productive struggle on Tuesday is a complete farce. I mean, the cognitive science goes against it. I mean, it's just not true. It's just wrong. But it puts an unneeded burden on a teacher. So we're trying to understand, what is struggle? What does it look like, feel like, sound like? And how does it play out in our classrooms? And so that's the K-12, but we're also looking at it in life. We're talking to painters, mechanics, architects, doctors, lawyers. I mean, we're running through all the different vocations to look for those commonalities. So those two projects. The other one we're looking at is feedback. Feedback is one of those areas in education where we've got a lot of research on it, but we don't understand what to do with a lot of it. Because we often equate feedback with grades, and we focus on only the giver of the feedback, not the receiver. And so I'm partnering with, oddly enough, a pediatric anesthesiologist in a very complex environment like an operating room to understand the role of feedback. And the hope is that we can extract commonalities that then we can generalize to other complex environments like a kindergarten classroom. Yes, the stakes are not life or death, but the stakes are still high in a very complex, ever-changing environment. And so we're trying to unpack how to make sense of some of the findings from meta-analyses, in particular visible learning, where the right level of challenge, okay, that's struggle. What does that look like? Okay, feedback has an effect size of 0.551. But what does that mean? What does it look like, feel like, and sound like? And how do I get that impact on my learners? And so that's where we are.
And these projects, are they throughout the course of the master's program, a few years long, or kind of what is the average length of a lot of these?
So those projects are the projects that my colleagues and I, Doug, Nancy, John, and Janet, do. The students have the opportunity to help and support them. In terms of the projects the students do, as undergrads, they're not required to do undergraduate research projects. And so most of them help with what I do. At the graduate level, they have the opportunity to, if they would like, but then of course they're working on their thesis. And if you're in the doctoral program, your EDD, they may pick something in that area, but they may pick something different. And so it does come down to choice. Right now, I have research assistants helping me. I currently do not have any graduate students on those projects because they've picked something else. So I just don't have any grad students with me at this moment, but they are research assistants. So that's how it works. It's more our projects, and then they join in if it's an interest of theirs.
So I get a lot of emails about the Teacher Clarity Learning in the Brain Institute. So talk to me about that. You said it's hosted in 3 different locations every year.
Yeah, so Learning in the Brain is probably, and I probably shouldn't say this might get me in trouble. Learning in the Brain is my favorite conference on the planet. It's one of the few conferences I attend and speak at, but also go through the sessions and just, I mean, gobble up incredible information on the relationship between neuroscience, cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and education. And it happens 3 times a year: New York or Boston. Then there's San Francisco. And so those 3 locations, it's just alternating: New York, Boston, San Francisco. And in fact, later on this week, I will fly to San Francisco for that one. And that one really is about connecting what we know about the brain and learning with classroom. And the Teacher Clarity and the Visible Learning conferences are run by Corwin, and those conferences are just as exciting. I don't always have the chance to attend sessions because I do a fair amount of presenting and have certain responsibilities at those conferences. But they are where we unpack what to do with the meta-analyses. Just like at Learning in the Brain, we unpack what do we do about the neuroscience and how to translate it into classroom practice.
So for teachers that are just starting the work with effect size and visible learning, which of these 2 conferences would you suggest they start off with?
So if you're interested in how people learn, and how to make sense of cognitive science and psychology on your classroom, the Learning in the Brain is the go-to spot. I mean, you're going to get to hang out with some of the nation's and some of the world's top neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and psychologists. I mean, Eric Kandel is a Nobel laureate. It's just second to none. Bob Sapolsky, the great stress researcher. Just phenomenal guys are there, and incredibly powerful scientists. Mary Helen Emmerdino Yang is one of my favorite cognitive scientists, neuroscientists on the planet at USC. She's there on a regular basis. That's where you would start your journey. If you're interested in diving deeper into visible learning, and not the neuroscience, but actually here's what the meta-analyses say. Now let's translate it. That's the annual Visible Learning Conference, or that's the Teacher Clarity Conference, or those are the virtual institutes that are offered throughout the year from Corwin Press and the Visible Learning team. Doug, Nancy, John, Janet, myself, Dominique Smith on desirable schools and belonging. That would be the launching off point for a teacher. Those would be my two biggest recommendations.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that. You also have some master classes on your website. So one of them is called Getting Them to Eat Peas When All You Want Is Ice Cream. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So one of my very best friends and colleagues, David Daniel, he's a developmental psychologist, and we worked at JMU together for 13 years before he retired. We would often sit around and just kick around ideas. And we were talking about engagement and the problem with engagement. It happened just as we were about to go into COVID, not knowing that we were about to go into COVID. But then during COVID, we had this incredible conversation about, okay, what do we do now? And David's point was, look, you're asking learners to engage in something that is fundamentally different from what they get at home. I'm asking them to engage in using trig identities to simplify expressions. They're playing Fortnite with their friends. Peas, ice cream. And so it's equivalent to setting a toddler down and getting them to eat their broccoli or their peas when they would much prefer ice cream. Just like asking a learner to sit down and analyze a John Donne poem versus be on their phone playing Roblox is the peas versus the ice cream. And so we have some choices. One choice would be give up and let them have the ice cream. And that's called edutainment. That's where we as classroom teachers decide to make our classrooms carnivals where everyone's having a great friggin' time, but nobody's learning a thing. Just like eating ice cream, you get full, but there's no nutritional value.
Yeah.
Or we can force them to eat their peas and they're miserable. Those are classrooms that are run on compliance and control. Again, they might eat their peas, but they're going to grow up to hate peas. They're going to grow up to hate you. And they're probably going to stick their finger down their throat in a couple of minutes and get rid of them anyway. So no nutritional value in the end. The middle part is serving them ice cream with the nutritional value of peas, or peas that have the flavor of ice cream. And as gross as that sounds, hang with me. How is it we capitalize on what we know about the research on engagement and utilize that in the classroom? In other words, we got to catch up and stop teaching the way we taught in the 80s before all of these other things were competing for the kids' attention. And that's really the message.
Yeah, I think it makes a good point, right? It's I think a lot of teachers, when they have disengaged kids or they're having classroom management issues, they try that edutainment piece, right? And I see those others who are doing that compliance piece, but really finding that middle ground. I think when we're starting to have meta-analysis of our teaching, right, and looking at the data, looking at students learning and what the data from each of our subjects areas are, that'll help us become better teachers. But I think, I think people can visit your website to access that course. Do you have other courses available as well?
The other one we did with together with AccuTrain, which is a great organization, is stoplights and sticky notes.
Okay.
And that one's really an overview of what we know about the science of learning. There are certain things that are stoplights. In other words, they stop learning dead in its tracks. And you find yourself sitting and waiting for somebody to go, and it's just not happening. So there are certain environmental things, there's certain we do that stop learning, the stoplights. And then there are sticky notes. Why do you use a sticky note? You use a sticky note so that you remember. So what are some things that we can do in our classrooms derived from the science of learning that actually sticky note learning so we remember it. So what it does is it analyzes things that support the acquisition, consolidation, and storage of learning versus those things that actually impede it. Stephen Chu at Furman, he's an educational psychologist, brilliant guy. He refers to them as pitfalls and choke points. What are pitfalls that stop learning and choke points that impede learning versus things that enhance it? And so it's rooted in educational psychology and the science of learning.
Yeah, so definitely people can check those out on your website. Well, we've had a great conversation around your work, what you've been doing at James Madison, how you got started with working with John Hattie in visible learning, and your trench story, learning about how to teach the first year of teaching when all you wanted to do was show everybody your passion about science, right? So out of everything we've talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I think as my career has kind of gone on, one of the things that I hope anyone takes away from anything they experience with whether it's John Hattie, whether it's the visible learning work, whether it's learning the brain, is the importance and the value of the teacher and the way the teacher thinks about his, her, or their role, and then the decisions they make. In other words, over the past few years, we've watched the deprofessionalization of teachers. I mean, to the point where we will allow someone without any degree to go in and well, of course, they've been to a school, so they're certainly a qualified teacher. That's complete garbage. The research on that is incredibly clear that that's going to be a disaster. It may take a few years for it to be a disaster. That's a mess because teachers possess a level of expertise and professional knowledge that makes them the single most powerful influence on learners in the pre-K through 12 classroom. And so the message is, don't let someone deprofessionalize or strip you of your expertise. But it also means we have to own it and leverage it and use it in a way that has an impact. It doesn't free us from responsibility. In fact, it gives us a powerful responsibility and a sense of hope, knowing what the research says about the value of a teacher.
Yeah, so important to remember, really, because there's always people out there who are going to say negative things about teachers, and it's really standing up for, this is what I'm an expert in. I, value my learning, my professional development in order to serve my students better. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
So one of the best things to do is to, and I almost am embarrassed to say this, but it's the easiest way to remember it. If you go to www.johnalmarode.com, there's a way for you to hit a button and send me an email. You can also search me up on the JMU website, and my JMU email is right there. So those would be the easiest ways to do it. I'm on X and I'm on Facebook, but not as much as I'm on email for sure. So please, by all means, email. Look me up. I'm happy to have conversations and keep the dialogue going around these ideas.
Thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure having you on, learning more about your research, kind of what you got you into, what you do. So thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.